Her hands were shaking as she reached for the phone in the visitation room. It was the last call she would ever make. Outside, the Virginia sky over Greensville Correctional Center was turning orange, then gray. Inside, a 41-year-old grandmother sat quietly, waiting for a death that the whole world was watching. In a few hours, she would become the first woman executed in Virginia in nearly 100 years. But to understand how she got to that room, we have to go back. Back to a small trailer in rural Virginia. Back to a marriage. Back to a chance meeting at a Walmart that would end 2 lives, and eventually, her own. This is the story of Teresa Lewis and her final 24 hours. Teresa Wilson was born on April 26, 1969, in Danville, Virginia, a town built around textile mills and quiet, hard-working families. Her own parents worked in one of those mills. She sang hymns in church as a girl, and by 16 she'd already dropped out of school and married a man she'd met there. That marriage didn't last. But her faith, in some strange, complicated way, seemed to. Years later, she married again. This time to Julian Clifton Lewis, Jr., a manager at the very mill where she'd grown up watching her parents work. On the surface, it looked like stability. Underneath, something else was quietly building. If stories like this keep you up at night wondering how ordinary lives take such dark turns, this channel is for you. Hit subscribe because we're just getting started, and the next 20 minutes will stay with you. By 2002, Teresa was living with Julian and his adult son from a previous relationship, 25-year-old Charles C.J. Lewis, home for a visit from Army training in Maryland. On paper, it was a blended family trying to make things work. But that fall, at a local Walmart, Teresa met 2 young men, 21-year-old Matthew Schallenberger and 19-year-old Rodney Fuller. What started as a chance encounter turned into an affair, and then into something much darker. Julian had inherited money after the death of his older son years earlier, and CJ carried a life insurance policy worth roughly $250,000. Teresa saw a payout, and prosecutors say she decided she wanted it. She gave Schallenberger $1,200 in cash to buy guns and ammunition, and promised him a cut of the insurance money once it came through. On October 23rd, the 2 men made a first attempt on Julian's life while he was out on the road. It failed. A week later, they got another chance. On the night of October 30th, 2002, Schallenberger and Fuller slipped through a back door of the family's trailer that Teresa had left open for them. She waited in the kitchen. Inside the bedrooms, Julian and CJ were both shot while they slept. CJ died almost instantly. Julian did not. While her husband lay dying, Teresa took money from his wallet and split it with the 2 men outside. Then she waited 45 minutes before calling for help. When deputies finally arrived, Julian was still alive, just barely. And in those final minutes, he managed to say something that would later become one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in the entire case. "My wife knows who done this to me." Those words would end up in her own indictment. At first, Teresa told police it had been a home invasion, random and violent, carried out by strangers. But cracks appeared almost immediately. Investigators learned she'd tried to withdraw $50,000 from her dead husband's account using a forged check before the bodies were even buried. That single detail changed everything. Within a week, on November 7, 2002, faced with mounting evidence, Teresa confessed to investigator Isom. She admitted she'd offered Schallenberger money to kill Julian, and that she'd let him into the trailer that night. But even in confessing, she wasn't fully honest. She initially claimed Schallenberger had acted alone, shooting both victims himself before taking the money and leaving. She led investigators to Schallenberger's home and identified him as her co-conspirator. It was only the next day that the full truth came out, that there had been a second man in that trailer, Schallenberger's friend, Rodney Fuller. Once Fuller was in custody, he cooperated fully, confessing that the plan had been Teresa's idea from the start, and that she'd organized the murder-for-hire scheme to collect on both insurance policies as their named beneficiary. With 2 confessions now pointing squarely at her, prosecutors had what they needed: Teresa was charged with capital murder. Schallenberger and Fuller, in exchange for their cooperation, were offered plea deals for lesser charges. At trial, prosecutors argued that Teresa Lewis wasn't a woman swept up in someone else's crime. She was the one who chose the targets. She was the one who recruited the men, funded the weapons, and stood to gain the most. The judge who sentenced her called her the head of this serpent. Lewis and her attorneys had gambled that pleading guilty and letting that same judge decide her sentence was her best chance at avoiding death, since he had never sentenced anyone to die before. They were wrong. In May 2003, she pleaded guilty to 7 offenses, including 2 counts of capital murder for hire. On June 3, 2003, she was sentenced to death. Here's where the case begins to feel different from most. Because the 2 men who actually pulled the trigger, Schallenberger and Fuller, did not receive death sentences. They were given life in prison. Teresa, the woman who orchestrated it all but never fired a shot, was the one sentenced to die. Her defense argued that told an incomplete story. They said Teresa had an IQ of 72, just 2 points above the legal threshold for intellectual disability in Virginia, a line that, if crossed, would have made her ineligible for execution altogether. Her attorneys described her as borderline intellectually disabled, someone with the reasoning ability closer to a young teenager than an adult mastermind. Then came a letter. Before his death by suicide in prison in 2006, Schallenberger had written to a girlfriend describing how he'd started the affair with Teresa in order to manipulate her, and how, in his own words, being with her was simply part of what had to be done to get the money. For her supporters, that letter reframed everything. Not proof of innocence, but proof that she might have been used by someone smarter and colder than she was. Prosecutors disagreed, pointing to phone records that showed Teresa had proactively reached out and pushed the plan forward herself. The case exploded into international news. More than 7,300 appeals for clemency poured in. The European Union spoke out. Even Iran issued a rebuke. It was a strange, uncomfortable spotlight for a small Virginia courtroom. Questions of gender, intelligence, and fairness in the death penalty, all tangled together in one case. But in September 2010, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear her final appeal. Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell refused to grant clemency. Teresa Lewis had run out of options. On the morning of September 22, 2010, Teresa woke up knowing it would be one of her last full days alive. Those close to her said she spent it the way she'd spent much of her time behind bars, singing hymns and praying with her spiritual advisor, Reverend Julie Perry. Under Virginia Department of Corrections rules, she was allowed 1 visit with immediate family before her execution. That visit happened that day, quiet and heavy with everything that couldn't be said. Later, she was asked about her final meal. She requested 2 pieces of fried chicken, sweet peas with butter, a Dr. Pepper, and either German chocolate cake or apple pie for dessert. Simple comfort food, the kind of meal that felt more like home than a last request. By the evening of September 23rd, the process had already begun. She was moved toward the death chamber at Greensville Correctional Center in Jarrett, Virginia. Witnesses, including members of the victim's family, were present. The only surviving member of that family, her stepdaughter, Kathy Clifton, was there too. Media witnesses later said Teresa appeared frightened as she entered the chamber and approached the gurney. When asked if she had any final words, Teresa spoke directly to Kathy. "I just want Kathy to know I love her, and I'm very sorry," she said. At 9:13 p.m., Teresa Lewis was pronounced dead. Corrections officials said there were no complications. Her lawyer, James Rocap, later released a statement saying the state had extinguished what he called the beautiful, childlike, and loving spirit of Teresa Lewis. He said that in her final days, she had comforted the people around her, that instead of them helping her face death, she seemed to be helping them. She was the first woman executed in Virginia since 1912, the first woman executed in the United States since 2005, and only the 12th woman put to death in America since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. In 2021, Virginia abolished the death penalty entirely, which means Teresa Lewis remains, and will always remain, the last woman ever executed by the state. Her case is still argued over today, more than a decade later. Was justice served? Or did the system punish the woman who could be caught and understood, while the men who actually pulled the trigger walked away with their lives? Was her intelligence taken seriously enough before a judge decided she deserved to die? Was she a manipulator or the manipulated? There isn't a clean answer. Death penalty opponents still point to her as proof that the system can get it wrong, or at least get it uneven. Others point to the calculation behind the crime: 2 people dead in their own beds, an insurance payout waiting on the other side. What's left in the end isn't a verdict, it's a question. A woman sat in a room on a September night, asking forgiveness from the one family member she had left to ask it from. Somewhere in that request, "I love her, I'm sorry," is the whole weight of the case. Not innocence, not evil. Just a human being, at the end of everything, trying to say the only thing that was left to say. Whether that was enough is something every viewer has to decide for themselves.